I thank Ryan for inviting me here to speak to you. I thank him for the plug for the book. By the way, I will say, and I'm biased, but I think it's one of the greatest stories about Williams College and Williamstown that's ever been told. So for future reference, I'll just put that out there. You can think about it over the next couple of months. So welcome back, and I hope all of you are enjoying your time back on campus. I wish the weather was better. When I proposed this topic to Ryan a few months ago, the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, I scarcely could have imagined that the horrific attack by Hamas and the prospect of a lengthy conflict in the Middle East would make this a topic of somewhat lesser importance for the moment. Of course, then again, I didn't realize just a day or two, a couple of days ago, that President Biden would now give a major speech linking Ukrainian aid with Israel, so it's back. I haven't had the time to fully incorporate everything about President Biden's speech last night. I will say I didn't think it was one of his finer moments for a variety of reasons, which I'd love to talk about during the question and answer, and we can certainly broaden the discussion to the events in Israel and Gaza and everything else. I did want to say one thing which I think is important to all of you as alums. I'm sure a lot of you are reading hair-raising stories about what's going on college campuses and how debates are being squelched, and it's just absolutely terrible. I will assure you that I've seen none of that at Williams. I teach a course in Introduction to World Politics, and my students and I have had respectful, informative debates about the events of the last 2 weeks, and I would say it's a model of how a debate about anything should happen at Williams College. So, and I will say another thing. If that weren't the truth, I'd tell you that too. So that was not just a line that they paid me to say. I fully believe that and would be prepared to document. The primary subject I want to talk about today is the issue of a potential negotiated settlement to the conflict, now 18 months in duration, between Russia and Ukraine. Now, understandably, but I think mistakenly, this is not a popular subject for debate or examination among academics or American and European policymakers. By the way, if you listened to President Biden last night, you'll realize he said not a word about negotiations of anything. It's clear, the rhetoric now is this is a fight to the finish. Now, of course, there is one central and good reason for this general reluctance to talk about negotiations. Talking about a negotiated settlement in the case of unprovoked aggression, even after the passage of 80 years, still conjures up images of Neville Chamberlain, Adolf Hitler, and the selling out of Czechoslovakia at the Munich crisis in 1938, or of the Yalta Conference, where FDR, Churchill, and Stalin negotiated arrangements in a way that Eastern Europeans considered at the time, and still consider now, to be a betrayal of their national rights. Now, analogies of foreign policy situations to Munich or Yalta are often badly strained, as they were when Lyndon Johnson often invoked Munich in explaining why he was escalating the conflict in Vietnam. But they do have some relevance to the current situation in Ukraine. In the 1930s, the Western powers made concessions to Adolf Hitler in the hope that this would prevent him from using force against his intended victim. Today, it is possible to argue that we would be making concessions to Vladimir Putin after he has already used force and carried out a brutal invasion. This would seem to be even less defensible than what the British did in 1938. Now, there is no doubt that Putin is not the equivalent of Hitler, but there's also no doubt that he's an autocrat, someone who wants to reestablish Russia's old dominance in areas that used to be part of the Soviet Union, and that he bears absolute and complete responsibility for the war. While one might argue that the West made a grave mistake in expanding NATO in the 1990s when Russia was down and out, that does not change the fact that Ukraine is both an innocent victim and one that has shown remarkable heroism in fighting back and enduring all the horrors that they've had to endure over the last 18 months. Now, since calling for a negotiated settlement means that Ukraine will not regain all of its rightful territory, and we have to kind of understand that. That's what negotiations means in this context. It is quite understandable why supporters of the Ukrainian cause might not want to even raise the issue of negotiations. There is no getting around the fact that ending the war with a negotiated settlement is not going to represent the satisfying and pure triumph of good over evil that Ukrainians and other victims of aggression would deserve in a much better world than the one we unfortunately inhabit. Now, not surprisingly, antipathy to the idea of a negotiated settlement to the war is strongest among the Ukrainians. Now, in the weeks and months after the outbreak of the war, even President Zelensky was somewhat open to the possibility of reaching some sort of an agreement in which Ukraine might accept a neutral status in exchange for a Russian pledge not to invade. In words that have sometimes been invoked by President Biden and others, President Zelensky also suggested in May of 2022 that he recognized that the war could only be definitively ended by diplomacy. Okay, now, there were some discussions in the immediate aftermath of the war, in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion about ways to bring an end to the fighting. The Ukrainian position has hardened considerably since then, largely as a response to the evidence of countless and ongoing Russian atrocities. The new stance seems to be that diplomacy can only take place after all Russian troops are expelled from Ukraine. This is a kind of change, and when most people hear the phrase a diplomatic solution to the war, the argument is, well, we'll negotiate, we'll give up this, you'll give up that. Ukraine's basic position is diplomacy will only ratify basically gains they have already made on the battlefield. And the Ukrainian government's official position on ending the war, their so-called 10-point plan or peace formula, was presented to the G20 last fall. I'm not going to go through all 10 points, but a few of them are worth highlighting. 1, Ukraine's territorial integrity is not open for negotiations. Russia must unilaterally withdraw all of its troops and armed formations from Ukraine. That's before negotiations begin. 3, a special tribunal needs to be created to try Russians for war crimes and an international mechanism set up to make Russia compensate for all the damages caused by the war. Finally, Ukraine will require proper and effective security guarantees and must be included in any post-war security architecture. It's not an explicit call for being allowed to join NATO, but that's essentially what it is. Now, in many respects, these Ukrainian conditions for peace are fairly standard and unobjectionable. No country signals in advance what it might ultimately concede at the bargaining table later. It's also not surprising that Ukraine has been quite emphatic that it does not see any alternative to their peace formula and that they are not going to look kindly on other states putting forward alternative conceptions. In their view, there are no alternatives to this peace plan. Only Ukraine, the country fighting against this war of aggression, can define what just and sustainable peace looks like. Therefore, all the initiatives of other states for a peaceful settlement can only be based on the Ukrainian peace formula. Now, it's important to note that the Ukrainian government's position on negotiations is in line squarely with the opinion of their public. Numerous opinion polls, the most recent one taken in July, found that 84% of Ukrainians opposed making any territorial concessions to Russia, even if this means prolonging the war for an indefinite period. It's also worth noting that the Ukrainian public opinion overwhelmingly favors fighting to regain all territory lost since 2014, which means that they are unwilling to accept an end to the war if Russia remains in control of Crimea, which they already annexed in 2014. Now, public opinion is very important here because it means that at some point in the future, if President Zelensky decides to pursue a course of negotiations, it's not clear whether he would remain in power for adopting that position. That's the amount of domestic political opposition he will face if he does that. Now, what's interesting is that Ukraine has been remarkably successful in getting the West and NATO to back their positions on negotiations. As late as 100 days after the Russian invasion, President Biden was still willing to state publicly that the war would eventually have to be ended by a negotiated settlement, although he was quick to add that it was not his place to tell the Ukrainians what territorial concessions they might make. Around this time, Biden also suggested that part of his job was to find a face-saving way out for Putin to end the war. But for the last year or so, the administration has been fairly consistent in making it clear that they are not going to try and negotiate or put forward any negotiations unless and until Ukraine indicates it is interested in doing so. Whenever Biden or officials in his administration are asked questions about Ukraine, their responses are almost always some variant of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and that America will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And a lot of that is obviously unspecified. How long is how long. Now, Biden has maintained the stance against negotiations both within his administration and within the Democratic Party. There's a great example of this last October. 30 members of the congressional House delegation, Democrats, sent Biden a letter citing the quotes that I just gave you from Zelensky and Biden earlier, and said, hey, you know, what's happening along these lines? The next day, they officially withdrew this letter from consideration because Nancy Pelosi and other members of the Biden wing of the party said, this is unacceptable. We're not going to put this kind of pressure on Biden, and the letter was withdrawn. They blamed it on staffers releasing a letter somehow without their knowledge. I mean, I've heard much better excuses from Williams students for why assignments aren't turned in, but that was the line, and that letter vanished. The following month, General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated in a public speech in New York that it might be a good time for Ukraine to explore negotiations because basically it was highly unlikely that they were going to be able to expel all Russian troops from their territory. Also, winter was coming, and his argument is, hey, maybe now's a good time to explore negotiations. The administration made it very clear that Milley was not speaking for Jake Sullivan or Anthony Blinken or the president himself, and all that talk was quickly shelved, and Milley has not spoken about this argument ever again since then. Now, by the way, it's important to note that this taboo against even speculating about negotiations is very strong in Europe as well. Just this past August, the Chief of Staff to the NATO General Secretary offered his opinion that perhaps the war could come to an end if Ukraine were given NATO membership in exchange for ceding some undefined territory to Russia. Ukrainian representatives went ballistic when they heard this, basically forced the NATO General Secretary to denounce his Chief of Staff, and that's exactly what he did. The statement that NATO put out was, quote, "It is up to Ukraine to decide when and on what terms to achieve peace, and clearly there was a need for security arrangements to ensure that there was no repeat of this war." What does all of this add up to? It adds up to the fact that Ukraine is strongly committed to fighting the war until they've either expelled Russia from its borders or until Russia completely capitulates and surrenders. Now, there's one thing that's really crucial to add. The government and the people of Ukraine are the ones paying the ultimate price. There are not NATO forces or American forces fighting in Ukraine. They are only asking others to help them basically resist aggression, which is very, very important. They want, obviously, our military and economic assistance, and it's clear, I think, very plausibly, that we have a moral and strategic obligation to help Ukraine. I don't want there to be any doubt. The moral case is so obvious that it doesn't need to be restated. Russia attacked a weaker nation without cause or provocation and has committed countless war crimes in the process. But the strategic obligation is no less compelling to many. Ukraine here is worthy of support because it has gravely weakened one of our biggest rivals. It has revitalized and enhanced the NATO alliance after the NATO alliance was basically, under the Trump years, seriously floundering. And it has also helped us send a vital message to China that they should consider that the risks and costs of starting a war over Taiwan might be much greater than they expected. And again, they have done all of this without the direct involvement of American or NATO ground forces. If you listen to Biden's speech last night, Biden's argument is basically the Ukrainians are doing things that basically the greatest beneficiaries are us and our NATO allies. So, like I said, I think that we do have a moral and strategic obligation to Ukraine. The real question is whether that obligation means that America and the West need to discourage all efforts at diplomacy or accept that the return of all the Ukrainian territory is the most important war aim. And here's where I would disagree. I think it is past time for the Biden administration to seriously consider the possibility that this approach to the war and negotiations may no longer be in the best interests of Ukraine, America, or our NATO allies. And it's this case that I'd like to talk about in the rest of this talk. Now, the case against our current approach to the war has to start with the very real possibility that the all-encompassing military victory that Ukraine seeks is simply unobtainable. The Ukrainian military has done a remarkable job and one that exceeds almost all expectations that analysts had before the war. If all of us think back to where we were in February 23rd and 24th of 2022, the idea that we would be talking about when Ukraine might be able to totally expel all Russian forces from Ukraine would have been a great fantasy. It was a tremendous achievement for Ukraine to have reclaimed almost 50% of the territory that Russia seized in the initial months of its invasion over the course of this past year. But the grim reality of the situation is that over the course of 2023, the battle lines have barely moved despite the long-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive. Over the course of this year, there's a big story in the New York Times last month, Ukraine has reclaimed 143 square miles of territory that Russia occupied, but Russia in turn has acquired 331 more square miles, which is a net gain of almost 200 square miles. Now, not all miles are created equally in this world, so that figure doesn't tell you all very much. But what it does tell you is this idea that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is moving inexorably to reclaiming all of Ukraine is far too optimistic. The other thing that must be noted is serious observers of the Ukrainian counteroffensive always said it would be a long, slow process. This idea that Ukraine would instantly just replicate all the successes they had last fall. No serious military observers thought that. And the reason why I want to point that out is when people say that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has been a failure, that's not true either. It's just we should keep a measured view of what its success has been and what it may be in the future. And here's the reality. The reality of the situation, the military situation, is that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict has come to resemble the First World War. Just like in that conflict, the defender has most of the advantages in battle. Russia's dreams of taking over Kiev are long past, but their job now is much easier since all they are trying to do is hold on to the parts of Ukraine that they already occupy and have had a lot of time to fortify their defenses. Taking back that territory by going on the offensive, as Ukraine is now trying to do, is a much harder task. Just like in World War I, the likely result is that there will be very high casualties on both sides, but the front will not change all that much. And in a war of attrition, Russia still has a very large population advantage over Ukraine and economic advantages as well, although that is in many ways offset by the material and aid provided to Ukraine by America and the West. The bottom line, as Barry Posen of MIT suggests, the most likely outcome on the ground in Ukraine is, quote, a long, bloody, and ultimately indecisive war. Now, of course, it is also possible that Russia could hold its territory in Ukraine, but still lose the war and be forced to sue for peace. This path to victory is based on the idea that Putin will either decide to cut his losses because he thinks that he can't win in Ukraine, which, by the way, is true, and that the economic sanctions imposed by the West are too painful, or that domestic political pressures may cost him his hold on power. Another possibility that people often speculate about is that one or more members of Putin's inner circle will depose him and then settle the war on a much more favorable basis to Ukraine and the West. The argument will be, hey, we got rid of Putin, we should get a break at the negotiating table, but obviously we're going to have to settle on terms very favorable to Ukraine. Now, either of those outcomes is certainly possible, but we should also remember that Putin has been in power a long time, over 20 years. Just this summer, Putin survived a rebellion launched by the head of the paramilitary Wagner group, even though that group was well positioned to seriously threaten his regime. The leader of that rebellion, of course, as you all know, then subsequently died in a plane crash or a plane explosion shortly afterwards. Like Russian troops collapsing in Ukraine, I think the prospects of Putin being removed in a coup are not great. Possible, but not great. To be fair, it's also hard, the counter-argument, it's also hard to see Putin negotiating a settlement of the war that would be acceptable to both Russia and Ukraine. But I would argue that those odds are somewhat higher than him being deposed or Russian troops being knocked out of all Ukraine. Now, we have another option to consider. It is quite possible that contrary to all of my expectations, Ukraine actually does much better on the battlefield and maybe is on the verge of knocking all Russian troops out of Ukraine. The question we then have to face is what Russia might do to avert a humiliating defeat. One of the things that I find really worrisome is that analysts emphasize how absolutely terrible and brutal Putin is, but then say, but of course he would never escalate to nuclear weapons or anything like that, which I find it hard to see how you hold both of those views about Putin. Now, if Putin really believes that the Ukrainian regime is filled with Nazis and that the West is intent on using Ukraine as a launching pad for future attacks on Russia, it is hard to see why he is not going to use every weapon in his arsenal or pose risks directly to NATO members like Poland or the Baltic states. Is it possible that Putin might use a tactical nuclear weapon against some target in Ukraine if his situation was truly desperate? Now, even people who rightly discount that possibility, when the situation is not desperate, concede that the odds of Putin using nuclear weapons will go up considerably in that situation where he is faced with defeat. And the question is, what would restrain Russia from using tactical nuclear weapons in a situation where they thought they faced total defeat? That the West will apply harsher sanctions or provide Ukraine with more advanced weaponry? I don't think that's likely to be a deterrent. Now, the one thing that might restrain Russia would be the fear of American or NATO retaliation with nuclear weapons, but that's not going to happen either, since that would invite Russian attacks directly against NATO. In short, Russia could use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It would be obviously a very dangerous escalatory move that Putin would certainly not take lightly, but that's different than saying it's impossible and we have nothing to worry about, which I think sometimes analysts just simply say, not going to happen, move on. I don't think that's true. Okay. Let me give you an analogy to think about this question of Russian escalation. Keep in mind that President Biden started off the war with at least 2 weapon systems that he was unwilling to send to Ukraine. First, Biden resisted sending cluster munitions to Ukraine for over a year. This is based on the argument that much of the world bans cluster munitions. The United States does not, but Biden did not want to kind of break that kind of international consensus. But he did, and this past August, cluster munitions were sent to Ukraine. Second, and just this past week, some of you probably read about this, Ukraine carried out a long-range strike against a Russian airfield in Luhansk with ATACMS, Army Tactical Missile Systems. I always think maybe they signed it because ATACMS sounds like a kind of cool acronym for a weapons system. Now, the reason why this is significant is that President Zelensky had pushed Biden for this weapons system from the earliest days of the war, and Biden had always told him no because he thought that Putin would view the introduction of that weapon as an unacceptable red line. But again, Biden basically changed here. And my point here is simply that if President Biden can be brought around to escalatory moves that he previously thought were too provocative, in a situation where Ukrainian forces are doing much better than they were at the outset of the conflict, it seems hard to see why Putin would not consider crossing some of his own red lines to avoid a catastrophic defeat. Now, the case for moving towards some sort of negotiations is based on the idea that Ukraine cannot regain all of its territory at an acceptable cost, as well as the belief that Russia is far more likely to escalate the conflict before accepting a total defeat. But there's a simpler and more basic reason to consider negotiations, and that is the tremendous toll the war has taken on Ukraine and will continue to take. Ukraine does not release any official casualty figures, for good reason, but this summer the U.S. government estimated that Ukraine has already suffered 200,000 casualties, with around 70,000 of those casualties killed in action. Ukraine has also suffered 10,000 purely civilian casualties since the start of the conflict. To put that in perspective, that is considerably more deaths than the United States suffered in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, obviously in a much shorter time period, and obviously the United States' population is far greater than Ukraine's. In addition, over 1/3 of a population of 40 million people has been uprooted and forced to flee their homes over the last 18 months, with over 6 million citizens forced to leave the country. Let's turn to the economic picture in Ukraine, also quite grim. Ukraine's GDP contracted by around 30% in the year after the Russian invasion, and while it is now slowly returning to modest growth levels of 2 to 3% this year, it is going to take over a decade for Ukraine to get back to pre-war levels under the best of circumstances. International agencies estimate that Ukraine has suffered over $150 billion in damage to its basic infrastructure and has experienced damage not seen in Europe since the Second World War. The World Bank estimates that Ukraine will need about $411 billion in reconstruction aid. That was $411 billion in reconstruction aid, a figure that Ukrainian observers and other observers probably think is too low by about half. You compare this to something like the Marshall Plan, for example, and Ukrainian aid will dwarf that, even doing all of the calculations and constant dollars and everything else. Now, some prominent economists have argued that, well, we don't have to worry about Ukrainian reconstruction because we've seized lots of Russian assets and we can just take those and pay for Ukrainian reconstruction. It sounds like a really good and feasible idea. The problem is it will create lots and lots of systems about the global international economic order. Many countries rely on the fact that their central bank assets cannot be seized when they're placed abroad. That's why the Biden administration has moved very, very slowly along this, and many American legal experts don't think you can do this. But even if you could, those seized Russian assets will only pay a portion of the cost of Ukrainian reconstruction right now. And again, the longer the war goes on, the higher that bill is going to be. All right, now we get to the real problem. You can make a case for negotiations, but that's a lot easier than saying, well, how do you make those negotiations happen? And that step is a lot easier than coming up with a feasible deal that both sides would accept. So even if you agree with everything I've said up to now, I really haven't gotten very far if I can't do the other two parts. Okay, so, and again, we need to consider one other thing. I'm basically talking about this from a NATO-Ukrainian perspective. It's quite possible that Russia is not even remotely thinking about negotiations on its side, or at least not negotiations in any sense that we would find acceptable. Now, unfortunately, my day job of teaching fabulous students at Williams has prevented me from fully working out all of the details about how negotiations will start and how the war will end. So with that caveat in mind, let me offer a few thoughts on both of these problems. First, President Biden has repeatedly said that nothing about Ukraine gets decided without Ukraine, and that is a correct approach. We should never think about negotiating with Russia directly over the heads of Ukraine or without having them have the biggest and most important seat at the table. But President Biden also owes President Zelensky an honest conversation in which he is told that the continued support of America and NATO cannot be guaranteed by anyone. And I want to clarify this. Biden has been a steadfast friend of Ukraine right from the start, and he's about to go to Congress to ask for approximately $60 billion in further assistance to Ukraine, which is on top of the already $75 billion in assistance that we've already provided. Biden's credibility on the issue of aiding Ukraine to the hilt is established beyond challenge. Now, if President Biden were president for life, and if he did not have to get money for Ukraine through a divided Congress, and a Congress which actually at this moment can't pass any aid bills or anything else like that, perhaps he wouldn't have to have that conversation with Zelensky. But without trying to forecast the 2024 election, it is clear that Biden is likely to be in the fight of his life with a Republican candidate who is far less sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause, unless by some miracle Nikki Haley were to win the nomination. She's actually very enthusiastic about supporting Ukraine, but she virtually stands alone in the Republican field. The likely Republican nominee, who we are all too familiar with, and I won't talk about him directly today, has repeatedly said that he will settle the war in a matter of days through negotiations. Now, given his past relationship with Putin and Zelensky, I think it is safe to assume that any deal former President Trump negotiates with Putin will be much more favorable to Russia than any deal negotiated under Trump's auspices. There is virtually a zero chance that Trump would continue to provide aid at a fraction of the level Biden has provided. And I think the Ukrainians are well aware of how much their fate turns on American domestic politics, and I think that is something that needs to be talked about directly. Now, the basic problem, however, goes much deeper than President Trump and his stance on Ukraine. A CNN poll in August revealed that overall American support for aiding Ukraine is slipping. Over 55% of respondents said that Congress should not give additional assistance to Ukraine, and 51% felt we had already done enough. Those numbers would have been even more unfavorable if the poll had been limited to Republicans. According to another poll, only 39% of Republicans now think that we should be sending any weapons at all to Ukraine. Indeed, despite the fact that former House Speaker Kennedy McCarthy had been already moving in a direction much more critical of Biden's aid request for Ukraine, the Republican hardliners who ousted him last month thought that he was insufficiently hostile to opposing President Biden on aid to Ukraine. It's a good indication of where the Republican Party is going on this issue. Again, and by the way, I want to add, Mitch McConnell is different. Many Senate Republicans are very pro-Ukraine, and that's important. But it's highly doubtful that in a presidential election year, Ukraine is going to find the levels of support that they enjoyed in prior years. And if Republicans win the presidency in 2024, it's clear Ukraine's position is going to become very perilous. Obviously, recent events in Israel and Gaza should also frighten Ukraine about what the future may hold. If this war expands, and it undoubtedly will expand, the question is how much it will expand. You can imagine there will be a competition over aid dollars, weapon systems, and everything else. And by the way, Republicans are much more willing to give aid to Israel than they are to Ukraine. And you can easily see Biden reaching agreements that give more of that aid. At the moment, Biden is calling for $60 billion in aid to Ukraine, $14 billion to Israel. You can easily see those numbers shifting for Biden in order to reach a kind of more consensus agreement. Okay? So clearly, Ukraine's ability to sustain the kind of great levels of aid that they've had for the last 18 months are in peril. Now, Biden's conversation with Zelensky, I think, should do one other thing, and that's to frame the question about how victory should be defined. The idea that Ukraine will have lost the war if it does not end with them in physical control of Crimea and all of the Donbass region needs to be rejected. Ukraine was not in control of Crimea or the Donbass region before Russia invaded in February 2022. And we need to remind both the Ukrainians and our NATO allies that Ukraine has already achieved a great victory in preventing Putin from installing a puppet government in Kiev and for inflicting tremendous losses on Ukrainian forces. Ukraine's independence is no longer in doubt, and it has already proved beyond a shadow of a doubt to the West that it is a worthy future member of both the European Union and NATO. A failure to regain Crimea or parts of the Donbass pales in comparison, in my view, to what Ukraine has already done. They've already won this war, in my view, in many ways. Now, working out all the details of any negotiated political settlement going to take a long, long time. Probably won't result. Well, maybe working together, we'll do it in the next 20 minutes or so. But all right, we'll see. But the first and initial step, I would argue, is to come up with a kind of armistice agreement, a ceasefire. Both sides agree not to carry out military operations, something like the armistice agreement that ended the Korean War in 1953. There's never been a peace settlement that ended the Korean War. They're still technically at war. They're just agreeing not to fight. That's not ideal. It would be much better if a war ended with a solid agreement and all the T's crossed and I's dotted, but that might not happen. It may never happen for one simple reason. Ukraine is never going to say, Russia, we will cede the Crimea to you, or we will cede the Donbass region to you. States generally do not cede territory, or at least, in any kind of legal sense. The problem is, I would argue, Ukraine's ability to take back those areas is highly in doubt. But what's important is they maintain the principle of their territorial integrity. And that's what a ceasefire, I think, would help to do. So a couple of things real quick. I think once the fighting stops, an armistice is signed, and negotiations begin, I would argue Ukraine and NATO will have many cards to play with Russia, favorable cards. First, Russia will be looking for substantial relief from the punishing sanctions that have been levied against them, and perhaps we'll be able to trade some sanctions relief for Russian withdrawal from some of the territory they now hold. And by the way, since we have seized many Russian assets, we can do that in a kind of incremental fashion. Who knows? Maybe that'll work. Second, we can find out what price Putin is willing to pay in exchange for deferring the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine. Now, remember, many people argue that Putin invaded Ukraine because he was fearful that Ukraine was about to become a member of NATO, American troops would then be stationed right on his border, and this was terrifying. Now, we could test this theory. We could basically tell Putin, look, we're going to let Ukraine into NATO in the next year or so, unless you're willing to make major concessions to make that, obviate that possibility. Now, we're never going to say that Ukraine can't be a part of NATO, but we can say we won't consider it for another 10 years or so, or something, or that will depend on future actions. I don't know, if Russia agreed to withdraw from all Ukrainian territory in exchange for Ukraine not becoming a member of NATO, I think that's a pretty good deal. I would take that, particularly since we could then turn to Ukraine and say, look, a much more solid basis for your security in the future would be a massive military aid package where you could defend your own security against Russia. You've already seen you can do it, and now we can arm you in ways that you won't need a NATO pledge to do it, which will be dangerous and politically contentious in many ways. In many ways, our goal should be turning Ukraine into a country like Israel, a country that can defend its own security and borders against hostile adversaries. All right, I will leave it there. I'm sure there'll be plenty of things to talk about, and like I said, I'm open for any questions about anything related to current world situation. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Yes? Yes, absolutely.
What credibility do you give to those?
I think it is true. Look, sorry about that.
Sure, there's recent reports that the Ukrainian economy is starting to recover.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what degree of credibility you give to those and how do you factor that into your assessment?
Well, you know, obviously, everything in economics is relative. When you have an economy that contracts by 30%, obviously, there's a long way back. But I find credible the reports that the Ukrainian economy, I saw the most recent figure I saw was that their economy might grow by 3.5% this year. That's a fairly healthy number for a country that's still at war. And look, I think a lot of this is, obviously, life in the eastern part of Ukraine is much more stable than it was in places like Kiev. You know, life is slowly returning to a situation of normalcy, which you won't see. I'm sorry, the western part of Ukraine, not the eastern. Yeah, so I find those reports credible, but math is not my strong suit, but if you're growing at 3.5% a year, it's going to take you a decade or so to get back to where you were in February of 2022. And that's assuming a whole bunch of things don't go wrong. By the way, just think about, you know, what would Ukraine's economy be like if substantial numbers of people who have been sent abroad could come back and start doing productive work again rather than being in Poland or Germany or other places. I am relatively optimistic that Ukraine's economy can make strides moving forward. Yeah. Yes?
I appreciate all of your observations, but one problem you indicated earlier was sizing up Putin. And a lot of people have sort of stated that Putin's determined to expand Russia to its former borders or whatever. So let's say there is this truce, this armistice.
Yeah.
What's to stop Putin from simply using that time period to, you know, strengthen his army, strengthen his, go over a strategy, revise it, and then restart the war?
So absolutely right. And by the way, it's one of the most, assume everyone heard the question. That is the biggest argument against an armistice, which is Russia will use this as a kind of resting space to rebuild its army. The problem is, and look, all you need to do is look at a map of what Russia, where the front line is in Ukraine right now. I have not seen serious analysts who argue that Russia is going to be in any position anytime soon to kind of break out of that area, to mount new offensives, aimed at, Kiev or other places. Now, obviously, Putin, will try and do things that, make his military stronger. I haven't heard a convincing argument that he's going to have the ability to now create an army which will be able to do what he wasn't able to do in February of 2022 when the Ukrainians had nothing, were not on a war footing, and did not have access to all of this Western aid. Now, you're right. He may indeed try again. The argument is, I think when Putin went to war in February 2022, he clearly thought, look, I'm going to be able to do all of this in a couple of weeks. It'll be a relatively easy fight. I'll install a puppet government in Kiev, and we'll go from there. I find it hard to believe that the next time he mounts a major offensive in Ukraine, he's going to be that confident of success. And what reason would he have for being confident next time around? So I don't disagree with you at all. Putin may indeed say, hey, this is my life's task. I'm just not sure he has the ability to do that. By the way, this assumes, of course, that America and NATO continue to back Ukraine. Like, I'm not saying, like, hey, we sign an armistice, put our hands together and go home. We'll still be monitoring this situation. We'll still be ready to do it. And I think my argument is we'll be able, Ukraine and NATO and the United States will be able to deter Putin moving forward. Just as, by the way, I think Putin's not going to attack the Baltic states because he knows that means World War III because they're NATO members. So that's why I'm confident. But am I certain? Absolutely not.
Now people are talking about the New World Order, and in spite of Ukraine, and now perhaps Israel, how threatening to us is this BRICS economic alliance coming together now in spite of Ukraine?
Yeah, I'll answer this one quickly. I don't even lose 10 seconds of sleep worrying about BRICS becoming a challenger to. The question is, there's been a lot of talk about the BRICS nations, which is actually a kind of Goldman Sachs invention. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are the BRICS nations. They've actually expanded this a couple of months ago, and some people speculate this is going to become a counterweight to the Western-dominated economic order. I am not worried about this at all. I just am not. Again, and you just look at all of those. By the way, they've added Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. No, nothing's going to displace the U.S. role in the economy. People are not going to be investing all of their funds in China or Russia or Brazil. So no, I am not worried about it. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that there isn't a kind of global South movement that we have to think about. By the way, it's very relevant to this question. The global South, by the way, is much less sympathetic to Ukraine, really doesn't care all that much that Russia's invaded it, which is kind of worrisome. This will be a factor of some political importance. Economically, though, I'm not worried about it. Sure.
A little bit more. What do you think the chances are of that spreading more widely in the Middle East, and what happens if Iran becomes more overtly involved in terms of the United States versus Iran?
So, two things. Look, I think there are so many ways in which things could expand. Hezbollah could obviously get involved. You could have major riots and uprisings in Jordan and other places. I could see all of this. Look, Iran's stance on all of this is we like to do things through proxies, more covertly. We are not going to send our own missiles and our own men into this battle, but they will do everything they can through Hezbollah, through Hamas, through other groups, through, I guess just the other day, Houthi rebels were sent missiles that were going in Israel's direction that were intercepted. All of those things. Iran will not do anything that obviously directly would legitimate an American military strike on their territory or anything along those lines. That's my view as of right now, and I think it's the view that most, I'm not a Middle Eastern expert, but I think that's the general consensus, that Iran will do what it has always done, behind the scenes, covertly. Yes?
I'd like to go back to the question, Russia a little bit.
Yes.
Because I'm wondering what impact would the Russian people, or I know that he's a
Sure.
despot, but what kind of impact are the people now on the potential of Russia cooperating or retracting or changing courses? I know that he's the one that we're looking at, but what is the impact or the sentiments of the population?
I think that's a great question. And, I think, public opinion varies. Always, I think public opinion is always very hard to determine in a state where having the wrong opinion on certain issues can get you the wrong way. But we have had Russian public opinion polls, which people put validity in. I think there are lots of Russians who do believe that, hey, we're fighting against, a horrible enemy in Ukraine and NATO, and I'm sure there's lots and lots of rally around the flag effects. I'm sure there are also a considerable proportion of Russian citizens who kind of know that this war has been a horrible mistake and have probably suffered tragedies and deprivations, and I'm sure sanctions have hit many of them. Now the question is, when might those pressures kind of force Putin's hand? That's a really good question. I think it's that old line, things are always stable until they're not. And if I were Putin, I would lose sleep at night saying, hey, who knows where this ultimately may go. And by the way, the other thing, and I should have talked about this more in my talk, the other argument is that Ukraine doesn't actually have to win on the battlefield. It just needs to keep the battlefield going until all of these domestic pressures build up in Russia and there's a coup or something else. Come on, what are you doing? He's a friend of mine, not yelling. Yes? Sorry.
The one weapon that's in the background that you didn't mention would seem to offer a tremendous change in the battlefield would be the F-16s that Europeans are willing to loan, and apparently there are a tremendous number of pilots being trained now. Is it too little, too late?
So I haven't followed this issue. I think there's a lot of training involved. I don't think they're scheduled to kind of come into action for another couple of months. Is that right? I think it's somewhere early 2024. I don't know. It's a good question, and I wish I should have done more research on that question. I do think that's a 4 or 5 months down the road, though, before there's any possibility of them actually being deployed by Ukraine. I could be wrong.
Would you get out your crystal ball and suggest what might happen in Russia in the event that Putin is no longer in charge, for whatever reason?
So, sorry. The question is, what might happen in Russia if Putin were no longer in charge? And that's always a great question. Now, the speculation among most experts over the last 18 months is that if Putin is overthrown, he's actually going to be overthrown by more hardline people who want the war to be waged more effectively. He's not going to be overthrown by kind of more peacenik factions. I don't know, and I don't mean peacenik in a bad sense, but the argument is if Putin gets overthrown in a coup, it's likely to be by people who are going to suggest let's escalate the war even more than we have. I don't know whether I personally believe that. I could imagine some ambitious member of Putin's inner circle who says, look, if we depose him, reach out to the West and say, hey, look, we're willing to settle the war, but it has to be on some sort of reasonable terms. If you're going to say, no, you've got to pay for every last dime of Ukrainian reconstruction, and you've got to remove all your troops tomorrow, I suspect they would say, hey, well, actually, we're not going to settle the war and we're going to continue to fight on. So I think that would be a kind of very delicate balance. But I could see some general seizing power and saying, hey, now let's try and reach the best possible terms we can with the West and hope for the best. That's what I would see happening, but that I don't know. By the way, my crystal ball is terrible.
How soon are the reports of corruption in Ukraine? One hears this as a backstory.
Oh, yeah.
And can you explain how do they know about corruption and how serious is it?
Yeah, actually, I saw a story just the other day, which was amazing. It was background for this talk, that before the invasion, Ukraine was ranked number 2 in worldwide corruption levels, which is astounding when you think about it, ranking 2nd out of 194 nation states. What? That's a great question. I did not remember who's number 1. I just saw Ukraine being number 2. We could probably all speculate and guess. Maybe Nigeria, but I don't know. But Ukraine was number 2. Look, everyone, including Ukrainian leaders, realize that corruption is an endemic, horrible problem. It's, by the way, it's the main thing that has kept Ukraine from being seriously considered for EU membership, although, you know, obviously things are changing now. Corruption is absolutely endemic. My sense is that the West has told Ukraine this is something you have to bring to order. I have not recalled lots and lots of recent corruption stories. I have not read, you know, Ukrainian officials have done this and this with American economic assistance. I am sure there are a lot more eyes on it now, and obviously we have a lot more leverage over enforcing corruption. But on the other hand, when you're talking about $60 billion in aid and weapons assistance and other things, it also seems to me that corrupt people will find ways to interfere with that. So, look, I think you know, Ukrainians would be the first to admit that the biggest internal problem they face moving forward is getting corruption under control. And they also realize that this is going to be the main thing that keeps them out of something they really want, which is EU membership. Yes, absolutely a big issue.
What do you think? Sorry. What do you think Fred Greene would think of your analysis?
Oh, God. That's a question of the day. You know, so I would say the one thing is Fred would certainly think his views on anything connected to international affairs are superior to any of the views that I might develop on international affairs, and I have to admit he's probably right about that. Yeah, you know, I haven't thought about that, and I really I'm going to think about that a lot in the next couple of weeks. I think Fred, you know, a couple of things. I think he'd be a lot more hard line on Russia than I am. I think he'd say there's no point in negotiating with them, and you're just going to have to defeat them militarily and pay whatever price you have to pay and do it. And I think he would have loved President Biden's speech last night on the issue of Israel and Gaza. I think that would have had deep kind of personal meaning to him, and I think he would say, look, Israel has to defend itself, and it can't not respond, and it's got to do something in a serious way. I think he would also be concerned about the fact that Netanyahu is running this. He was not a fan of Netanyahu, and he obviously was critical of many things the Israeli government had done, but in this issue, he would certainly support Israel's right to self-defense and would recommend that, you know, this is not something to be taken lightly. This is Israel's 9/11 moment. I think that's true in a lot of ways, which, by the way, doesn't necessarily imply that Israel should respond to what happened in the way that we responded to our 9/11, which obviously was flawed and mistaken in ways that we're all going to pay for. Well, we already have paid for and will continue to pay for. But he would not be calling for a ceasefire or anything like that at this moment. I see a couple
Yes,
of
sir.
hands up. One
Yes,
over
sir.
here.
Right here.
Oh, sorry.
Question.
If we follow your prescription and there is a negotiated peace, if you're living in Moldova and one of the states in Moldova has now elected a Soviet puppet, if you will, what confidence...
Do you mean Slovakia, by the way?
No, I'm talking about Moldova.
Okay, Slovakia just elected someone very kind of pro-Russian as well, but sorry.
So if you're, if you just negotiated this peace that you're talking about, what would be your feeling if you're in Moldova, or what should the rest of us feel would be the next step? I mean, how would you have any confidence whatsoever that Putin wouldn't do it again?
Well, look, I wouldn't sure. Well, let me put this another way. If I'm a citizen of Moldova or a leader of Moldova, I have to accept one basic reality, which is I live in a neighborhood dominated by a nuclear power that's a great power that obviously is willing to use force and coercion and other things. So I'm never going to rest happy about anything related to my security situation. You know, I think we could also, in any kind of armistice negotiation or something else, we could obviously work in provisions that, you know, this does not mean you are free to attack other countries or coerce other countries in that region. But, you know, let's come back to another basic point, which is, you know, the West is not going to get involved every time Russia exerts its power in its backyard. For example, if Russia went into, you know, Azerbaijan tomorrow or Armenia, there are limits. I mean, we'd protest in the UN and everything else. Unless things are much different than I think, these are not things that we're going to go to war over. I could be wrong. I saw a question over here.
Yeah, so one question is
Here,
okay, so one question. So is there a potential scenario in which Putin is provoked to utilize tactical nuclear weapons, which paradoxically creates a situation which is more favorable to Ukraine in terms of NATO support,
Sure.
et cetera?
Yes, I could immediately tell you what that situation is. Let's imagine Putin did use a tactical nuclear weapon against some Ukrainian military target. It is quite possible that China and India the next day would say, hey, this is absolutely unacceptable to us. Tell Putin, hey, any support, we've given you lots of support, bought lots of your oil, lots of other things. This has crossed a line that we're going to stand with the world consensus and outrage about using these weapons. And if you were to tell Putin tomorrow that he no longer has China, you know, behind him and India and other countries like that, that would be serious, and that would be to Ukraine's benefit. By the way, we haven't even gotten into the China scenario, but there are lots of ways that China can prop Russia up and do lots of things that help keep Russia fighting, just as we can do things that help Ukraine at. I mean, if China ever reaches this decision that we can't afford to have Putin or Russia lose this conflict, well, then all bets are off as to what the future holds, but it won't be good. But paradoxically, that could be the one thing that, you know, if you're saying, how could Russia use tactical nuclear weapons and it comes to the benefit of Ukraine, that would be step one in how that would benefit Ukraine. I'm not sure I would want that, you know. I don't think any Ukrainian leader would wish for that, but yes, it could work out that way. I could talk afterwards. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking about this with you. Thank you.